I live in Kentucky. It's very backward and rural, and even though I've lived here for a year now, I'm still not used to the large amount of woods and secluded places. I'm originally from the beaches of Florida. It's completely different here, and it still takes me a while to get used to the surroundings. I live in my parents' house in a rural area. Although it's close to the highway, it's not the most densely populated area. There are 2 gas stations and a dollar store. It's also about a 20-minute drive each way, which I think means it's a pretty decent rural area. Anyway, we live on an acre of land, and about 30 yards behind our house is a large 150-acre farm owned by a farmer. Mind you, we've never seen this guy before, but he plants his plants during planting season. A lot of strange things have happened in the year we've lived here. But to name a few, there have been times when I've seen a ghost, heard random noises, and while aliens can't be considered paranormal phenomena, I swear to you I've heard high-pitched noises and seen lights in the sky. But we live 30 miles from Fort Knox, so maybe it's military stuff. I don't know. However, this is where the road makes a sharp turn. My family and I have noticed that none of our neighbors, and there are about 6 of them, go outside around 9 p.m. Now I can understand that. But after all, where I came from, there were always at least a few people out in the evenings. But here, there's not a single late-night party or anything like that. Nothing at all. These people just don't go out at night. It seemed strange to me at first, but I didn't really pay attention to it until recently. A few friends and I would occasionally get together and go out on the back porch around 1 o'clock in the morning and smoke, look at the stars, and just have a good time. Every time we did this, a field about 100 feet away from us would start making noise like someone running through the bushes. Me and my buddies above the kite used to laugh about it, but that was until we heard a squeal coming from the area. Needless to say, we haven't done that since, which was about a month ago. It's just been baffling me ever since. I've always worried if there was some wolf lurking in the night, and I have to admit that up until 2 nights ago I thought so. 2 nights ago I went outside at 11:18. We have a compost bin, so after cleaning up the kitchen, I took the food scraps and everything else out there. It was pretty dark, but peaceful. I should mention that we have a steel fence around our acre lot, and the compost is in the back of the lot next to the fence. There is a gate on the fence that leads to the farmer's field. I don't know why, but it's there. And so, as I walked towards the compost, I was overcome with a huge sense of unease. I felt like I was being watched, maybe even stalked. It was dark as hell, and I couldn't see a thing. I had enough light from the outside porch light to just see in front of me. I tossed the leftovers into the compost, and then I heard the exact same rustling in the undergrowth. This is when I got cocky and felt like some jerk teenager or someone was trying to scare me, so I stood still for about 20 seconds in the direction of the noise. And then I started to panic. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, shook it twice to turn on the flashlight, and pointed the flashlight in the direction of the noise. In fact, other than bushes and soybeans, I couldn't see anything there. But something odd caught my attention. Reflection. I froze in confusion for a second and returned the light to where the reflection was. And holy crap, there was some creature about 4 feet tall sitting on the soybean plants, looking right at me with huge red eyes. I honestly don't know how I did it myself. I do know that I ran inside as fast as I could, and even though I have terrible asthma, it was the fastest running I've ever done. Needless to say, I entered the house, locked the door, and ran to the basement. My room has no windows, which is both a blessing and a curse, but there was no way this monster could have gotten into my room. I finally passed out and woke up last night around 7. Skipped dinner and everything else, but immediately went outside to the same spot. And there was nothing there. I even went into the field to see if what I saw was just red berries or something, but there was nothing. Back at the house, the neighbor went outside. I immediately called out to him, and when he came in, I asked him if he had seen anything unusual here, to which he replied that everyone I know, including myself, goes inside before dark. Stories of hellcats and night crawlers are everywhere around here, and with that being said, he just went to turn off the grill and went inside the house. I got very little sleep last night, mostly chatting with friends about everything in the world, and since most of them live in Elizabethtown, about 25 minutes away, a decent-sized town. They have no idea what it was. Anyway, I'm speechless right now, and if you've listened to the end, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. I am very scared right now, and I don't know what to do. I'm sure it could have been an animal, but this thing is unlike any animal I've ever seen. I'm contemplating going outside with a high-beam flashlight and surveying the area from my porch, but honestly, I can only mess up my life this time if I see it again. Please, if anyone is from Kentucky, let me know. By the way, I told my mom about it. I could tell by the look in her eyes that something was wrong. After I explained it to her, she said that one night she was sitting on the porch talking to a friend when she heard someone climbing over the metal fence and heard footsteps coming toward her. She just didn't want to get out of there, and within seconds she was inside. It was very strange. She couldn't see anything, and our fence is about 4.5 to 5 feet high. We also have a porch fence, and I'm not quite sure what's going on, but it's definitely not normal. Oh, and I almost forgot, but on the farmer's property, about 80 feet from the edge of our lot, there is a sinkhole that connects to a small cave. I hadn't thought about it at all, but there's literally fallen trees and stuff that went into the ground, and it just fell in. And I'm wondering, what if this creature lives in there? Some people have advised me to buy trail cameras and stuff, and I'll do that when I can. But for now, I'm going to use a spotlight at night and a night vision camera to catch anything. I'm also going to shoot a plan of my house, but I just don't know how to post it. Here's another thing some people have commented on. Dogs. The neighbors to our left have about 4 hounds. Oddly enough, they are pretty quiet during the day and sometimes at night, but often they start barking and at some point just go crazy. It's very strange, and I think it might be leading to something, but maybe the dogs can sense something. It's really weird because the same night I met the dogs, they were actually barking. I forgot to mention this, but there is something that is really confusing me at the moment. There has been a very strange noise coming from last night. I can only describe it as birdsong, except it's circling and very far away. Anyway, I heard the noise last night, and I thought it was in the damn driveway. And today, when I heard it again, I went to follow it, but when I got closer, it just disappeared, which was really weird and creepy. I tried to think of what the noise could be, but I've just never heard a noise like that in my life. I also did a little research in our county records today, and it turns out that the land the farmer owned was government property in the 1960s and 80s. That's very strange to me, and it doesn't say why exactly, and I know that almost all property is owned by the government until you buy it. But in the 1890s, it was owned by farmers again, and then it was bought back. Everything there that was available for government control became inaccessible, literally inaccessible. I will find a way to post a picture of it, as it is in the City Hall records. Also, there was a man-made crater built somewhere in there, and there used to be over 600 acres of controlled property, meaning everything else was around there. I think even our own house was on it, and it's certainly getting a lot of attention. Beginning to wonder if this was some kind of experiment, if there was a reason for it. I still think it's pretty weird, of course, but I didn't hear anything strange today, other than what was going on outside. Or it was around 10 p.m. when we had a smoke and everything. I mean, everything outside just went quiet. No bug noise, no crickets, no dragonflies, nothing. Just dead silence. I don't know what that means, but I finished and just went to hell inside. Just then, something very strange happened. I was home alone, or so it seemed to me. Dad had left for work early in the morning, around 4 o'clock, and Mom had only left for the store 2 hours ago. I was coming out of my room to get something to eat when I noticed Dad sitting on the couch from my vantage point. That's what it looked like. At least I could only see the top of his head. I was surprised because I hadn't even heard him come back, and I said, "Hey, Dad, when did you get home? I didn't even hear you open the door." And he replied, "Well, I got back about 10 minutes ago. There was something very unpleasant about that, but I didn't question it. So I just said, okay, continued on to get my appetizers." No sooner had I reached the pantry than he asked when Mom was coming home. I replied, "I don't know." She called and said she was being discharged, so maybe another 30 minutes or so. Why? Just curious, man. It was weird because my dad never calls me baby. And when he said it, his voice was a little deeper too. I had a bad feeling, so I turned around and went to the couch, but I noticed that no one was sitting on the couch. I looked around very confused because he was just there. I went to the window and realized that Dad's car wasn't in the driveway. It's been about an hour since it happened, and Mom is already home. This isn't the first time strange things have happened around here, and I doubt it will be the last. When I was about 15 years old, I started babysitting for a family with 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl. Their mom knew me, and the older one was friends with my younger brother, and asked the mom if I could help because she was starting to work more shifts, and her husband was doing the same. They lived near my school and paid well, so I said yes, even though I didn't have much experience. And pretty quickly I realized it wasn't going to be easy. The kids were great, but I was nervous around them. The older one was fine, he just played on his Xbox or did his homework most of the time. But the younger two, they were a whole different story. The middle daughter was completely fascinated by horror movies, and more than once I had to hide knives from her because she wanted to replicate them. And the youngest even tried to set the Christmas tree on fire. I know how kids can be because I have a lot of younger and older cousins, but these ones just drove me crazy, and I was constantly worried that they might hurt themselves or even each other. If they played along, I threatened to call their mom, which usually worked. However, after a few months, I realized that if I mentioned my dad, they would behave and do what I asked, so I started doing that. I had never met my father. I just knew he was very tall and large, but he always described me as a very nice man, so I never gave it much thought. This time, I told the younger boy that I would call his dad if he didn't stop acting up, which led to a major tantrum. I ended up calling him and explaining everything. Luckily for me, the dad was leaving work early, so he said he would be home as soon as possible and apologized for the child's behavior. When I explained this, the child burst into tears and ended up locking himself in his room. Dad came home that day, and they didn't make a joke about him being tall. My height is only 175 centimeters, and I was 15. And when I saw him duck down a bit to get through the door because of his size, I remember thinking, damn, no wonder kids don't prank when he's around. I said hi to him and apologized for calling from work. He just shrugged and said it should be done and not to worry. We both sat on the couch, and I don't remember why, but I think they were talking about what days they needed me or something like that. At this point, the younger two went outside to play, and I stayed with the older one as I was just cleaning up after dinner. It was also quite strange to me that the older one started getting nervous when he was asked to go shopping. He kept making excuses to his dad, so I just offered to go instead. I could see that the dad was clearly upset and just wanted to defuse the situation. I would also like to point out that everything seemed pretty normal at the time, but I remember being very afraid of my father. I only met with him once and spoke for no more than 20 minutes. It turned out that Senior had told my mom that he didn't want me alone with my dad because he apparently watched me too closely during the brief meeting. The parents asked me to babysit that week, and I agreed. A few days later, however, things quickly changed. I received a text from my mom apologizing for not being able to babysit at the last minute. I was a little worried as I had a change of plans, but didn't worry too much and told her that it was fine and to just let me know if she needed me. She asked me to stop by her place to get my paycheck for the last 2 weeks, and I just decided to hang out before heading home. And as soon as I got home, I noticed something was wrong, but not wanting to pry, I just walked in, said hi, talked about our books for a bit, and then just left. It didn't start until the next week, I think, or maybe the week after. I came home to my mom, upset and very angry, who was thrashing around the living room while my stepdad tried to calm her down. I immediately went over to her and asked her what was wrong, but I have to admit I was a little worried. Immediately, she just hugged me and cried and snuggled up to me. I was going to be a babysitter, but I got canceled again, so I came home earlier than promised. However, I pulled away in confusion and asked her what was wrong. Turns out my mom was trying to call me, but my phone was dead. I went to the babysitter's house, but no one was home. so I decided to go back to the bus. But I couldn't tell my mom. But she sat me down and started asking me about my dad and babysitting. Embarrassed, I said I had only seen him once and had only talked to him on the phone a few times when the kids were behaving. Nodding, the mom started to insist and asked if anything else had happened and kept questioning me, saying I could tell her anything. I just looked at her confused, told her nothing had happened, and asked her what was wrong. I always remember at that moment she took a deep breath and said, "Oh, thank God," after which she told me what had happened. Like I said, the details were unclear because it was on the news, but it turned out that the guy had killed someone at work and was caught by the police. During questioning, it came out that he admitted to beating his wife, and there was speculation of assaults. It was also mentioned that one of his types was petite girls with dark hair, pale, which matched my description at the time, and my mom was obviously afraid something bad would happen to me. I turned 23 this year, and I still get goosebumps when I think about it. I remember the ringing sensation in my stomach and feeling like my stomach was sinking for days. My mom was cradling me in her arms, crying because she had been sick all day and was afraid something bad was going to happen to me. Needless to say, I immediately stopped caring about my family. However, I felt terribly sorry for my wife because she was one of the sweetest women I had ever met. About a week later, I got a text from her. It turned out that I had forgotten some books, and I told her I would pick them up after I called her. When I saw her, my heart just dropped. She was clearly awake and making a brave face in front of the kids who didn't realize what was going on. We ended up sitting in the kitchen, and I put my arm around her, trying to comfort her. I told her that if she needed help with the kids, since they were gone, I would try to help, but she immediately refused, as it appeared that people had started attacking the house. She gave me my stuff, paid my wages, added some more that I had completely forgotten about, and said she appreciated it, but it would be better if I just left the family because she didn't want me to get hurt for associating with them. To this day, I still think about them, and I still get scared at the thought of what could have happened. I still socialize with the younger children who are much older now, and I even help raise her younger girl. I helped the older one when he moved on to middle school because I noticed that the kids were making fun of him for something his dad did, which was horrible considering the whole family wasn't to blame. So, I had just gotten back from the beach and went to the house to look for my grandmother. The door was unlocked, and she never leaves without locking the door. I didn't see her on the couch, and the bedroom door wasn't closed, so I knew she hadn't dozed off, but like I said, it was odd that she wasn't on the couch or on the porch. I looked at the table, but the note wasn't there. I called out to her and heard a muffled noise. At first, I thought it was a muffled cry for help, so I ran to follow. Not seeing her on the bed, I ran to the bathroom, but she wasn't there either. I called out for her again, but didn't hear anything, so I checked the bathroom again, and then went back into the bedroom. I swear I saw her lying on the bedroom floor. I saw her long enough and well enough to make out what she was wearing, a blue sweater and jeans. But when I blinked, she wasn't there, and for a moment I thought I was just imagining it, so I ran to the house and looked around to call my mom or something. This time, however, I saw my grandmother's neon yellow notebook on the kitchen table, so bright that it was impossible to miss it. And there was a notation that she had crossed the street for a second. For a second, I felt so disoriented and confused. I went back outside, and there was my grandmother and my neighbor, and she was wearing a completely different outfit too. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want to scare anyone, and I don't know if anyone would believe me, but I hope that whoever this person is, they get help. A few years ago, my friends and I used to ski in a disused quarry, which is now a national park in the UK. And as teenagers, we spent quite a bit of time there too. As teenagers, we found ways to amuse ourselves, sometimes at the expense of others. Nothing too sinister. We were just regular kids with nothing to do. One of our favorite pastimes was to turn off our headlights and park inconspicuously, so that other cars couldn't see us. A lot of people would park there and smoke pot and hide from the police. We would hide in the car in the dark, and as soon as we saw someone pull over to smoke in peace, We would pretend to be police officers, meaning we would turn on the blue lights and siren as loud as possible on our sub. It was fun for us, but I get it. It's not all that good. Obviously, it would make the people in the car panic and try to hide the weed to get away as fast as possible. It's funny, but we ended up doing that to a few friends when they realized it was just a joke. Over the years, however, we saw a motorhome parked in the same spot almost every night. We never paid attention to them because you could never look inside, and they always seemed idle and dark. The motorhome was clearly an outdated model and quite dirty. The only thing, apart from the fact that it looked a bit out of place, was that it had the biggest antenna I had ever seen mounted on top of it. One evening it was very quiet in the quarry, and we were about to go home because there was nothing to do. Or, should I say, terrorize anyone. A friend asked why we didn't scandalize the people in the motorhome. We explained that, like I said, it just never seemed like anyone was home, but after a while we decided to bang on the door, try to shake the car and yell, "Earthquake. Very sad, stupid teenagers." All four of us got out of the car as quietly as possible, and I crawled around the muddy mobile home. We counted to 3, tried to hide our giggles, and proceeded with our plan. We shook, banged, and yelled that the earthquake was in full swing, and after about 30 seconds there was no response. We looked at each other because clearly no one was home, and it was totally anticlimactic. We started walking back to the car, which, when the door of the motorhome opened rather quietly. We all heard the door creak open, turned to see who was there, and froze at what we saw. People started jumping out of the house neither quickly nor slowly, but as if nothing had happened. It was quite strange, but the fact that they were all wearing masks, black masks, made our blood run cold. They were wearing identical black cloaks, and there must have been about 8 or 9 of them. It was safe to say, however, that we had ordered them out. But we ran as if nothing had happened, went back to the car, jumped in, started the engine, and tore out of the quarry. The 3 of us looked back to see if they were following us, but luckily they weren't. They just stood there looking in our direction. The door of the motorhome was still open, and as we pulled away we saw that it was lit by candles, and only candles. No wonder we never saw any light from the windows at night. Of course, there could be an explanation for this, like they were playing a prank on us because we were playing a prank on everyone else in the park. Either way, it was awful. My son is one of the most honest boys I have ever met. I'm biased, I know, but still. I was very young when my son was conceived, and it was a big shock to me and his father because I was on birth control. However, he is the most loved and spoiled little boy. He is also literally a light in all my darkness, and there is definitely a reason he is here, planned or not. He is made for this world. My ex, my son's father, had a best friend who died exactly a year before my son was born. His name was Dean, and sadly, he died on July 13th, but my son was born exactly 1 year later, on July 13th. Dean tragically died after jumping into an open body of water on a hot day, and his body went into instant shock. He suffered a massive heart attack and died within seconds. He was a very talented and thoughtful man, and this is a huge loss to all who knew him. When I found out I was pregnant with a boy, my ex and I decided to name our son Dean in honor of his friend. We were extremely shocked when my due date fell on the 13th, and even more shocked when my son was born on the day he gave birth. We always knew there would be some sort of connection between them, because they had too many similarities. My ex and I separated when my son was 6 months old, and he only saw him occasionally since he lived many miles away from us. Naturally, my son never heard Dean's story from me because I didn't feel obligated to tell it, and we wanted to make sure he was old enough to understand. But my son did all the usual weird things when he was little, smiling and waving his arms, talking and playing with someone no one else can see, etc. He also sleepwalks regularly, as I do. He is very often awake and awake at night, so I am very used to his state of sleepwalking, and when he is actually awake. He would sleepwalk and do weird things like try to take a bath or stand in the middle of his bedroom and talk to the walls. Things like that. But you get used to them. About 4 months ago, he woke up and called me. not upset, but clearly wanted me in the room as soon as I could get there. My other half expected him to be sleepwalking when I arrived, but he was awake. He told me that in the middle of his bedroom he saw a boy with long hair in a pool of water smiling at him. I couldn't answer right away because I was very shocked. I asked him if he was asleep or dreaming, and he said he was not. He woke up to the splashing and saw this boy. He eventually went back to sleep, and that weekend my son saw his father. I explained to my ex what had happened, and he was as shocked as I was. I explained that I thought it was time to tell him Dean's story and see how my son would react. He agreed and said he would let me know when he came to pick him up the next day. The next day, my son came home with blisters as usual, and my ex brought me up to speed. He explained that he first told my son that he was named after one of his close friends who was now in heaven. Then he showed him a picture of Dean, and my son immediately said, "Oh, that's a boy. That's the boy from the water. He was in my bedroom." My ex said he was both scared and excited to be back with my son. Then my ex said he was a great guy and that he would love my son. Then my son said, "I know he's very smiley. I know that water is very dangerous." And my ex was stunned. He nodded and said that's right, and that's how Dean died. It's true that children are much more open-minded than us adults, and to this day neither I nor my ex can explain what happened except that Dean was visiting my son. I work second shift at my company, usually from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. On the street where I work, I can get home two ways. The left one leads along the railroad tracks. There's a 24-hour hamburger and Mexican fast food restaurant there that's open until about 3 in the morning. The police station is also a 10-minute walk from the tracks, and the right leads directly to the highway I'll take to get home. If I go left, I have to turn onto side streets to get to the highway, since it doesn't connect to the road for several blocks. Or go back across the railroad tracks and past my workplace to get to the highway. I hope I haven't lost you, but it's important. So I got out a little early today, around 12:30. Lucky me, right? I was hungry, so instead of driving straight home, I decided to go for hamburgers. I usually roll down my window and listen to music on my phone. As I was closing the car door, I noticed a rather large spider. Okay, it was the size of my thumb, but to me it's still a big spider weaving its web on the street between my window and the side mirror. Spiders, they freak me out. And if it had been inside, I would have knocked Usain Bolt out of that car, I tell you. Since it was outside, I left the windows closed and turned on the music. As I was leaving, I saw the barriers coming down. I'm not stupid enough to try to outrun it, so I stop and wait for the barrier. While I'm waiting, out of the corner of my eye, I see movement, and then I see him. A ragged man in his 30s, with messy hair and wearing dirty clothes, standing next to my car. We have a few homeless people here, but they don't usually bother you if you just ignore them and don't talk to them. I thought he would eventually leave, but he didn't. He walked over to the driver's side and tried to open my car door. Thank goodness my car has automatic locks that engage almost as soon as you turn the car on. But then he starts banging on my car window. He keeps yelling to be let in, and I reach for my phone, but of course in my panic, I can't get it out of my purse and immediately drop it on the edge of the seat. I'm afraid at this point it will break the glass or something. I have a folding baton in my car, but in my panic I forgot about it. Finally, I pick up the phone and dial 911. I yell at him to back off and that I've called the police. He goes around trying to get into my car through another door, keeps yelling at me, calling me every name possible, telling me to get out of the car. I give the dispatcher my location, and it seems like forever before the cops show up, but it's probably only been a few minutes. Meanwhile, the guy is crawling over my car and pounding on it with his fists. Sure, the train has already left and the barrier is up, but I don't want to risk killing this guy by throwing him over the tracks. I'm sure if he dies, he'll be charged with manslaughter at the very least. I'm not sure about that, but I didn't want to risk jail time for this lunatic. Luckily, I see police lights and he runs away and one of the cops gives chase. The other cop tells me to stop at the hamburger place and calms me down. He writes down all the information I can remember in my panicked state. Then he delicately says something like, It's a good thing you don't have your windows down. And then it hits me. They didn't fall off only because of that spider on my car. They also didn't find the guy because there are a lot of places to hide, and the terrain is pretty rough at night, but they said they would increase patrols in the area. But the cops assured me that I did everything right that I could do. Didn't get out of my car or call for help or anything, and after that I decided to just not eat because I wasn't in the mood anymore and just went home to freak out and methodically quadruple check all my doors and windows. The cops also said they'd call if they found anything, so we'll see, I guess. I don't know what he did in there, but it was a pretty awful situation, and I don't mind spiders anymore these days. When I was a kid, I lived in the middle of nowhere in northern Canada. For several years, we lived in a very large, very old house, more than 2 hours from the nearest town. The house was built next to an old native cemetery. In fact, I'm talking no more than 20 feet from the front door. I spent many hours walking the land around her house and even sat on the edge of the cemetery thinking about it, but I never set foot in it. Next to the house ran a river in which a young girl had drowned many years ago. The house hadn't been lived in for a long time, but occasionally hunters would visit. But we were very remote. We had no electricity or running water, and the nearest neighbors were only a few miles away. My father raised cattle and was often in the barn or 45 minutes away at his parents' neighboring ranch. But one day he was in the barn and the door closed and locked him in there. He screamed for about 20 minutes, believing someone had arrived and was taunting him. Suddenly the door was unlocked and there was just no one there. No one had taken anything away. The first time we heard singing was shortly after this incident too. My mother and I were cooking dinner on the wood stove. It was already completely dark outside, so it was winter, when suddenly, clear as day, we heard indigenous singing. Since my mom was still a little freaked out by the incident in the barn, she assumed it was my stepdad messing with her and tried to guffaw. Not 5 minutes later, he called on the radio from his parents' ranch 45 minutes away and said he was going to be late for dinner. This happened several times, and I remember lying in my mom's bed with her and just listening. There were no other sounds around us, and it was unmistakable. My little brother also moved from his room to theirs because his door would just slam shut without any explanation and stop as soon as he stopped sleeping there. There was a lone wolf that roamed our property at night. He never hurt us or the other animals, but we saw him a few times in the dark, and there were always tracks. I remember dreaming about the same woman over and over again. She had long braids with a dandelion behind her ear, and she was always wearing a red dress. I told my aunt that I was seeing her in real life, but it always happened in the middle of the night, so I couldn't be sure if it was a dream or not. One night I was hysterical, probably crying in front of my mom because I was afraid of dying unexpectedly. I was a kid when it happened, so I don't really understand all the details, but I always wondered if it was them, and if they were offended by us or something. We eventually broke up, life goes on, and we have a cool story that no one believes. But here I am, just under 20 years later, in another city, in another province, sitting in my daughter's first Reiki session, and halfway through, the therapist looks at me and says she feels a strong indigenous spiritual presence around me. In fact, it's such a strong feeling that she has to say something. She says she feels like I was taken in by these beings as a child, and now they are my guardians or something. So, I think I finally have an answer. First of all, they were never angry, at least not at me. I have a story that I experienced when I was a 4-year-old boy that I need to get out of my life. I lived in a third world country in South America. My young parents had moved into a new apartment. The landlords of the apartment had mental health issues, both mother and son. I don't remember much about them, but from the stories I heard, they were pretty scary people. They gave off a dark aura or something like that. Anyway, I remember these mannequins moving around the house while my parents slept. And every night I'd see the same thing. They were hiding in the bathroom, in our living room, and pretty much everywhere. There were at least 10 or 20 of them. They looked human, but without emotion, and their skin seemed almost fake and pale like plastic. Although I don't remember it, when we walked past regular stores with mannequins, I would start crying, and they would be confused and not understand why I was crying. I don't think my parents could see them at night, and they seemed to have a ghostly form and almost physical. Anyway, it was hell to see these creatures watching me from my parents' room almost every night. At that age, I sometimes slept next to them. I also had a small crib because I was a very hyperactive child. I could hear them moving things around, and I remember seeing their inexpressive faces. I also couldn't go to the bathroom without my dad because I was terrified. Then one day, as I was sleeping, I felt like I had just been lifted up and quickly awakened. They were mannequins, 2 of them. They tried to carry me away, but they plopped me down on the floor and quickly left. Something must have scared them off because I have no idea why they let me go. My parents woke up and quickly found me in the middle of the room on the floor. They had no idea what or who had moved me, and it wasn't until later that I told them what had happened when I was a teenager. To elaborate on their appearance, I will say that they had plastic hands. They were pale. Most of them had no hair and no facial expressions. They were of average height, thin to average weight, but not as thin as mannequins. The dead eyes, I remember and will never forget, looked almost androgynous. But that aura was the scariest thing I had ever experienced until that day. So I need somewhere to share it, and I don't know what I want, but I think I want to know that I'm not crazy. My sister, 17, and I, 20, were on vacation with my parents in the Bahamas. We stayed in a beautiful beach house surrounded by a large piece of land. There were about 2 other houses on this stretch of beach, and the other houses were about 1 kilometer away. My sister and I shared a room just off the main living room and bathroom. I had a double bed against one wall, and my sister slept on the bottom bunk of the bunk bed across from me in the corner. My parents shared another room on the other side of the main living room. One night I was suddenly awakened by someone's laughter. The voice sounded like a woman's, but the laughter sounded like laughter. I had never heard anything like it before, and it didn't even sound human. It filled the whole room, and I couldn't understand where it was coming from. It lasted about 5 seconds, and I lay in bed, absolutely frozen until it stopped. Then my sister said, "Did you hear that?" in a trembling voice. I whispered yes, and she asked if it was me. I replied that no, of course not. And we both just lay there sleepless and silent until the wee hours of the morning, when at 6 a.m. my dad came in and asked if we wanted to watch the sunrise. We immediately told him all about it, and he didn't think much of it, thinking we were imagining things or something. Although I'd like to think we're long past the age of fantasy, especially since we both heard the same thing. We both have no idea what time it happened. I'm guessing it was around 3 in the morning, judging by how long we lay in silence, but it's impossible to say for sure. I didn't check my phone because I was just afraid to move. After talking to my sister, she said she woke up before the laughter started, and that there had just been a rumble in the room. As if a train was moving, she was shaking. The rumbling and shaking got louder and louder. Then the laughter started. Then I woke up, and then it suddenly stopped. It couldn't have been some kind of dream conversation, because we both heard it, we both woke up, and nothing could explain the noise. Neither of us could figure out where it was coming from. When I had to pinpoint the location, I thought he was at the end of my sister's room and she was in mine. We also couldn't compare it to anything, which is pretty amazing. I don't know if anyone has an explanation or theory on this, even if they aren't going to give me their opinion. To be honest, it annoys me too because my parents are always teasing us about it, and we're in complete seriousness about how it's unexplainable. But it happened. Also, if it helps, this isn't the first time my sister and I have experienced apparent and unexplained paranormal activity while in the same room outside of the house. I was in a preparatory course that allowed high school students who wanted to go to university to get grades for admission. I was one of the youngest in my class. I was 23, 24 by the end of this story, and the vast majority of my class was between 32 and 53. My goodness, how many stories I could tell about that class. The class from hell. But I'll digress. For a year I was in the class mostly alone, socially awkward and all, And still the other students picked on me because I wasn't from the same neighborhood as everyone else, and my voice didn't sound like the ones from where I said I was incredibly shallow. Yeah, if you ask me. But it is what it is. However, it was one of the reasons I became friends with a girl named Tina. Dave was a 40-year-old man who was odd, to say the least. For your information, Dave was a little shorter than me in height. My height is 5'7". He was overweight, balding, had gray hair on the sides and black on top. He looked very fat and honestly looked a little older than his years, but to his credit, he was always very well dressed. Even though I liked Dave and was chosen to represent the class, he always looked out of place and made me feel very uncomfortable, because he always acted weird around me. He always looked like he was forced to smile and was always bragging about things that didn't really deserve to be bragged about. I worked 12 hours a day for the last 3 days, and still managed to make it to college because education is important. Things like that. I only talked to Dave outside of the group project 2 or maybe 3 times, and each time he just assumed something was wrong, although the conversations were mostly elevator conversations with a little bit of bragging, so I just kept my interactions with him to a minimum. He would openly make statements in class, such as that I could tell someone was mentally ill just by looking at them. And today's young people don't understand what it means to get off your ass and work. Instead, they take, to get an impression of the kind of person he was. There were a few times I thought someone was watching me too, and when I checked, I saw right away who it was, and you can probably guess who it was, right? Dave. Yes, Dave. However, as the year progressed, my classes deteriorated, and he followed the I'm a good guy schedule. Honestly, most of the time I just ignored him, but I wondered what was making the class worse. But that was a while after the group project. But it wasn't until the last day that I found out why. I was talking to Tina about how great it was that we both finished the course and moved on with our lives until Tina said, "I know, thank God I won't have to see Dave again." He was really creepy. I don't know what he was doing. I asked what she meant, to which she replied, "Wait, do you know what he said?" Tina told me everything he had said, and it was all about me. According to Tina, Dave told some crazy stories that revolved around me and constantly asked her questions about me and my life. Asking her about where I grew up, what I wanted to do in life, even about my family. It really freaked me out. Then came the stories he would tell my class. Apparently Dave talked a lot, to the point that if I had known about it at the time, I would have filed a harassment report against him or anything to get him as far away from me as possible. Apparently he was saying I was a desperate attention seeker begging him to be friends with me, saying that I was using my mental illness and health problems to make people feel sorry for me and get better grades, and that I didn't deserve to go to university because I was fake. At first I was amused at how pathetic I thought it was, considering we hardly ever socialized, but then it got awkward because he somehow found out about my health problems. And considering that no one but the faculty knew about them, I wondered how exactly he found out about them. But then the wild stories started. Stories that didn't even exist. According to Dave, I tried to hug him several times. One story was when he told me he had supposedly gotten into university, and I jumped for joy and hugged him tightly, yelling how proud I was of him, and he awkwardly and involuntarily hugged me back and then pushed me away. Second story. We were leaving the classroom when I turned to face the teacher and hugged him tightly again, and he resisted, after which I ran out of the room saying, "See you later, friend." And the teacher, and he mocked me after I left. The third incident, which is my favorite, happened supposedly in another class. I turned to Dave and tried to get him to hug me again, but this time he kept urging me to stop, and I laughed at his yelling. I guess I only stopped when the teacher intervened and said, "Stop it, you're not friends." I was surprised by these stories and thought that maybe it was just made up for fun or something. But no, when I saw another girl in class, I tried to ask her about the rumors, but as soon as I said his name, the girl yelled at me, "Leave Dave alone, you psycho!" Honestly, why the hell are you so obsessed with him? He's never going to talk to you, and she just ran away. Of course, I was very shocked. Tina apologized to me for not telling me sooner, but she honestly didn't know. Now, just so you know, I hate confrontation. Most of the time, I just try to avoid them, but I just couldn't let it go. I don't care if they call me names. It's a common insult, and if it comes from a class that knows nothing about me, it makes such comments even more pointless. But commenting on my character, telling made-up stories, and calling me crazy, I don't take that normally. I saw Dave later that day, but when I approached him to talk about all of this, he looked like he saw a ghost and just ran away. I ended up messaging Dave on Facebook, and I really hope that's the end of it, but somehow I'm not sure. It still scares me that all this time he was talking to me and imagining these incidents, and I knew nothing, and I hope I never see him again. When I was 15 years old, I moved with my sister and mom to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to live with an uncle I had never seen before. As horrible as he is not the focus of this story. So my uncle picked up random people in town and paid them to work. He had his own tree trimming business, and frankly, he treated them horribly. But this guy he hired, I'm not going to say his name, he eventually moved in and started working for his uncle on a regular basis. Let's call him S. He drank heavily, but seemed like a nice and helpful guy. He always offered to help with things my mom and I were working on. I remember when he bought cookie dough for me to eat. And when he asked what happened to it, I confessed and he said, "I don't blame you. It's delicious. That's what it's meant for." Shortly after we moved in, he came over drunk to talk to my mom in our living room. She agreed. He seemed like a very open and kind person again, so it was really nice to talk to him. After a while of talking, he gives out something rather annoying. He told her that if there is someone around who has hurt her or is making her life hell, he would take care of them. My sister recently rekindled an old relationship and he ended up moving here to live with us and stuff. Immediately after he arrived, there were problems between my uncle and him, but nothing serious, just mostly fights. Let's call it a boyfriend. Anyway, right before M came to live with us, he had to get a huge settlement for an accident at work. He got it and kept it in cash. In the last couple weeks after he arrived, my sister and him quickly fell out of love. My uncle offered S a job and an apartment downtown. My uncle was also a carpenter, building houses, apartments, etc. The offer was for S to move into this apartment and live in it while he worked, so my uncle wouldn't have to. Again, he hires guys to work for him to pay them shit because he's a total asshole. However, S gladly accepts the offer. I'm pretty sure he not only gets a paycheck, but he can live apart from his abusive boss, and the joke came to him. After my sister and M lose interest in each other, he asks about moving with S to this new apartment to live and help work. They ended up moving there, and M's money was to be paid within a month of him moving in with S. So we moved into our house in a matter of minutes, and my sister lost contact with M. One night, my sister, my mom, and I are sitting in the living room, and my mom's phone rings, breaking the silence of the night. It's my uncle, and within seconds of the call, her face is contorted in an expression of disbelief and horror. I walk over and curiously sit down on the rug in front of her. I could tell by the look in her eyes and her cold mood that something was terribly wrong. She looked around the house irritably in response to our call. "Okay, calm down. Tell me exactly what happened." "And what exactly happened?" "Well, my uncle went over to Im. He pulled out a flashlight, and there's someone lying on the couch, but they're not in a relatively normal pose. They seem to have fallen on their hands. Their heads are lying on the seat, and the uncle comes closer, calling out to M. There's blood and brains spilled all over the person and the couch. He has been brutally beaten to death with a club. The uncle runs out of the apartment in horror. He calls the police. He calls my mom. My sister starts crying when my uncle recognizes her. Yeah, I think it's M. Soon he's on the news, but he's not identified. From the physical description, It's clear that it was her recent ex-boyfriend, M. So where was S, and where did all the money M received go? No one ever saw or heard from him until he was caught and sentenced to prison 3 years later. That's the story of how I lived with a murderer. I have insomnia, and 2 weeks ago I felt like I couldn't sleep and decided to go for a walk to relax a little. It was around 12:30 in the afternoon. Considering that I'm 5'6" and 250 pounds, I've never been afraid to walk at night, believing that people would be more afraid to see me than the other way around. But after about 10 minutes of walking, a chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I looked around and noticed someone walking in a hooded sweatshirt on the other side of the street. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just another insomnia, but the goosebumps wouldn't go away. Something about this guy was definitely off. At this point, I started walking faster and decided to cut the walk short and just go home. But the guy kept up and even started walking faster than me. At this point, I was sweating like crazy, but I was walking faster. 2 minutes passed, and I turned my head again to get a better look at the guy. And then I noticed someone else catching up on my side of the road, also wearing a hoodie. My brain went into panic mode, and I started running as fast as I could. Soon, I heard their footsteps, and by this time, I was outside my house and knew its location by heart. I jumped over the bike rack and down the dirt path that led into the woods near my house. Looking back, I realized that the woods weren't the safest choice. I knew they were still following me, but not sitting on my tail because there was a delay before they pulled onto the dirt path. My lungs were just burning, but I didn't care. I turned off the main path and went into the woods, picking my way through the trees on a small path that led to one of the neighbors' yards. I ran across my street to my house, turned the corner, went through the bushes around the house, and entered through the back door. By then, my whole body was on fire. I looked out the window and saw that they had just run past my house. I was safe, but I saw something that made my body go from burning to ice cold in a split second. They both had knives in their hands, and I mean big knives. I don't know if it was the running or the fear or maybe both, but eventually I threw up. I was lucky that night, I know. About 4 years ago, I worked as a laundress. I worked from 5 in the morning to 5 in the evening and often worked alone. We usually have a security guard by the parking lot. They have a walkie-talkie and pepper spray and they patrol the building that day. However, my new boyfriend started working, and I never saw him watching the parking lot when I arrived each morning. He stopped by my laundry room throughout my shift. He was talkative, but I noticed that he would often look at my body when he thought I wouldn't notice. One day I arrived at work and started packing up my things in preparation to start work. I hadn't turned on all the lights yet, so I couldn't see some parts of the room. Suddenly I heard static in the corner of the room and saw the red light on the radio. I turn on the light, and the new guy is standing in the corner of the room, hiding and watching me. When I asked him what he was doing there, he said he was just hanging around doing nothing and started laughing. It was obvious that he was waiting for me. Eventually, he did this so often that I just got used to it. But one day I came in early and was working in one of our small neighborhoods. He came into a small room to talk to me. He's a big guy, so I couldn't get past him. He just talked to me, but I couldn't move or leave the room because he blocked the door. He asked me why I came in early that day, and I said, because I had to leave later, and he said I had to tell him all my hours, so he would always know where I was. He leaned over me. He was very tall, and I felt like he was about to try to upset me. I also had a horrible feeling that he was going to try to do something, so I squeezed past him and called my supervisor, who said he would watch him. I told him I just had a bad feeling about this guy, and that I needed to leave for the day. And the next day, he was fired. And apparently he wasn't in the guard tower at the beginning of his shift, because he spent the morning in the woods near the parking lot recording the girls who came in for their shift each morning. In his locker, they found a huge collection of soda cans and coffee cups, which he admitted he had scavenged from the various dumpsters where I and the other girls worked. His wife soon left him and took full custody of their newborn child. For those unfamiliar with Grindr, it's a gay dating app that shows you guys nearby. It forces you to use your location while using the app, but it doesn't give you an exact location unless you send it directly to the person. Anyway, one day I got a message from an empty profile. No name, no picture, no bio. The only thing that caught my eye was how close it was, less than a mile away from me. This happened a lot because there were a lot of closeted guys, especially at the time. Being the obese guy in the gay community, I had to take whatever I could get, because most gay guys in my community didn't even give me the time of day. However, he started off well, introduced himself as Jesus, asked how I was doing, and things like that. And yes, Jesus is a pretty common name in some cultures. He told me he liked chubbier guys, and after exchanging pictures, we both agreed that we found each other attractive. He asked me if I wanted to go play video games and have some fun. I was dating a couple of Grindr guys at the time, and although we had a good time, it didn't work out in the end. However, I always met them in public places, so I never met someone at their house or went to visit them. Nevertheless, I decided that enough time had passed, and it wouldn't hurt to have some casual fun. Besides, he was really nice and really my type. He agreed to come and pick me up since I was only a few blocks away from home. Apparently, he lived in a neighboring trailer park. I decided I wanted to take a shower first, and he agreed. He then said he was really embarrassed to ask, but he wondered if I would lend him $20. Supposedly, he was living with his mom and she had gone away for the weekend, leaving him no food, no money, nothing. Looking back, I realize it was really stupid, but honestly, I felt really sorry for him. I told him I didn't have any money, but he replied that it was fine. I could just send him money through an app. I don't remember what it was called, but it was something like Venmo. Nonetheless, I send him to the shower and then let him know I'm all set. He says he's going to go, but he can't find his keys. I say that's fine, and I'll just wait for him outside. I hadn't given him my address yet, but I was almost ready. However, when I asked if he found them, he just didn't answer. Minutes passed, then an hour, and I texted him again to ask if he was still coming and saw that he was working and offline, so I knew he was reading my messages. I finally accepted that he was ghosting me and probably just wanted money. So I texted him one last time and just told him that things were pretty messed up and explained that if he had just asked, I would have given him the money without going through all of this. But what can I say? Sometimes I'm a softer person. A few weeks passed, but there was still no response from him, and I just blocked him. I get another message from someone relatively close to me on Grindr, and his profile is also empty, which definitely makes me suspicious. He tells me that he likes chubby guys too, and that really makes me wary because it's very unlikely that two chubby dogs live that close to me. We exchange pics again, and it's a different person. But suddenly he's asking for money again. On Grindr, you can create as many accounts as you want. All you need is an email address. But there were tons of automated spam accounts. It was a real pain. But I called him anyway because I was 95% sure it was Jesus. At first, he pretended like he didn't know what I was talking about, called me crazy, and then blocked me. I felt a little bad because I thought that maybe I had made a mistake and just kicked the guy out for nothing. But on the other hand, his sudden offensive reaction definitely made me wary. Weeks went by, and every now and then the same guy would try to trick me, though I didn't fall for it. Eventually, I jumped on him and asked him what his problem was. We started discussing it, and finally he said, "You wouldn't say that to my face." I told him that I would love to tell him to fuck off rather than expect him to actually show up this time. And he replied, "Well, we'll see about that. I'll see soon enough." At this point, I got a little worried, because it occurred to me that he might not actually be gay, but some homophobe who wants to beat up gays. My thoughts, for some reason, keep going back to those people who were murdered after meeting him on Grindr. I realize I didn't give him my address, so I must be okay. I say, "Nice try, but I didn't give you my address." He says, "Yeah, you did a stupid thing. You just didn't know it was me. Get ready. I'm coming." At this point, I started to worry because I gave my address to a guy who canceled at the last minute, but I didn't think anything of it because it was long before Jesus texted me a second time. I'm trying to figure out what to do to make a decision and document his threats. I say, I know I didn't give you my address, and anyway, what do you want to do to me? And he says, you'll see, I've got something for you. There are always police in the trailer park, and my neighborhood is separated from them by a bay. That night I kept hearing gunshots, so I started to panic a little bit. I mean, what if he has a gun, or what if he brought his friends with him? I say, yeah, so what? He says something to shut his mouth. I'm on the street. I started to get worried because I couldn't tell if he was just trying to mess with me or if he was really out. I took a screenshot of the whole thing and sent it to the Grindr admins to report him for credible threats of violence. I wasn't sure if I could call the police because if he lied, I didn't want to look like a fool. Besides, I wasn't sure it would be enough for them to do anything. I decided to look out the upstairs window and see if I could spot him. If I could make a model of his car, I might have something to give the police if necessary. I live in the middle of a cul-de-sac, so when I looked out the window, I can see all the way down the street. And when I looked out, I saw a car I had never seen before parked on the curb at the end of the road. My heart raced because somehow I knew it was him, but part of me hoped it wasn't. I decided to see if he was really there and said, "Well, I'm waiting." And he replied, "I'm already outside, where are you?" Of course I wasn't, but if it was him and he knew my address, then why didn't he just park in front of my house? And I turned out to be right. He says, "Yeah, I see you. You're going to get it now." And I say, "So give it to me. I'm right here." And he says, "Wait." I knew he couldn't see me from the car because I look out and we have a screen on the windows and people can only see a black screen outside. A few more minutes go by and eventually the car just drives away. I have a feeling he used Grindr to determine where my neighborhood was, but of course he just couldn't find my house because I didn't give him my address. Grindr later sent me a message saying that he was blocked on the app and that they had contacted the local authorities. I didn't hear anything more after that, so I don't know what came of it. The police also didn't contact me when they visited him, and I never heard from him again. Today I am married, so thankfully I don't use Grindr anymore. But it was still quite a while before I could sleep soundly after that. I also rarely left the house, and when I did, I always made sure his car was nowhere to be found. In retrospect, he was just a silly kid who just wanted to troll people. But then again, maybe he wasn't. My stepmom used to tell me these stories, and she doesn't mind me retelling them to you guys. All of these stories happened over 20 years ago, and she hasn't had anything like this to share with me since, except for what I personally experienced, but that's a whole other story. So when my stepmom was a little girl, about 8 years old, she lived in Mexico with her parents and 5 other siblings. My stepmom is the oldest, so she shared a room with the little ones in her family. But one night she told me that she accidentally woke up and saw 2 small children holding hands and standing next to her bed. According to her, they were transparent and just stared at her without moving. She was terrified but didn't make a sound so as not to wake up her siblings. She just froze in place. After a while she blinked and they just disappeared as if they were never there. She went back to sleep, figuring it was some kind of dream or something, and in the morning she didn't say a word to her parents. After a few weeks, she started seeing the 2 children around the house, but always out of the corner of her eye. One morning she was in the kitchen helping her siblings make breakfast when she looked up and saw the children next to her little brother. She immediately grabbed the nearest object, a wooden spoon, and lunged at the children, screaming at them to leave her brother alone. They disappeared, and her siblings were confused because none of them had seen it. She told them everything was fine and just went on with her day. Eventually, she said, she started seeing them almost every night. She would wake up from dreams she couldn't remember and see them just looking at her, no emotion on their faces, but they were always holding hands for some reason. She tried to tell them to go away and leave her family alone, but they would disappear and only come back at night. Finally, one day she saw them stir and reach for her mother. She yelled for them not to touch her mom, and they shook their heads looking at my foster mom. She stood her ground and told them to leave her alone, and they disappeared again. Her mother quickly started asking her what was wrong, and she explained what she had seen. Her mother was immediately frightened and told her father what had happened. From what I heard, the stepmother was taken away from the house to her aunt's house. They didn't say anything except that they would take her siblings with them, and that they would stay with her aunt for a while. My stepmother later found out that when her mother was pregnant with her, she saw the same children, and they tried to touch her belly where my stepmother had not yet been born. After her mother gave birth to my stepmother, she stopped seeing them, and when my stepmother told her mother that she had seen those children, she got very angry. They ended up calling a priest and eventually just moved out of that house. A few years later, they moved to the US and everything was fine. My stepmother told me how she remembered sometimes seeing people wandering around looking lost, but she could see right through them. She paid no attention to it, and after a few years, she just stopped seeing them. A few more years went by when my stepmother was single and had 3 children, all very young, babies and toddlers, and she lived 2 houses down from my parents' house, where her brothers now live. During the time she lived there, she constantly felt like someone was watching her, and she felt like there was a very evil atmosphere around her. That's what she told me. She attributed it to the fact that she was trying to relax, but somehow she was lethargic and tense. And she didn't live in that house for very long. And here's why. The last night she slept there, she woke up to something or someone poking her in the chest. She tried to get up or throw herself at whatever was pushing her, but her arms rested in the air. For several minutes she struggled, feeling this heaviness that continued to press down on her, until suddenly she was able to straighten up. She immediately got out of bed, grabbed the kids, and ran to her parents. She pounded frantically on the door until her brothers opened it and let her in. They were alarmed and asked what was wrong. They had never seen my stepmother so scared before. She is the kind of person who doesn't hesitate to get into a fight to protect people and doesn't look down on anyone. She also raised her siblings, so they always saw her as a very strong person. She explained what had happened and said she didn't want to go back to that house. Her brothers asked her to sit down and she made sure her children were there. Then one of the brothers noticed that she had a big bruise on her chest. She went to the bathroom to look in the mirror, and she saw a very large bruise there that looked almost like deformed hands. And it must be said that she spent the night there with the kids, and in the morning she explained to her parents what had happened. But she still refused to go back to that house, and eventually her brothers took everything out of the house. She moved to another place and still hasn't set foot in that house and refuses to even go near it. She has no idea who the owner of the house is or if any of them have had experiences similar to hers. She just blatantly refuses to have anything to do with that house. She once told this story to my dad, and he tried to say it was sleep paralysis, but she remembers very well that she could move. She just couldn't get up, and she has several witnesses to the bruises she suffered as a result of it. She doesn't want to talk much about it, but she swears that something evil definitely lives in that house.